everybody for hanging in there with us as we deal with the technical difficulties. And thank you, Patient Resource Center, for being here for us through the pandemic and as we enter this new phase of getting back to what we hope will be a little bit more of a comfortable life. I am thrilled to be here today and also a little bit freaked out, not just because we've been dealing with technical difficulties, but I think that the topic that we're going to be approaching is so important. I've been delving into the literature a fair bit over the last 2 months, and I want to share what I've learned with you. Now, one of the things that I've learned is that I ought to have made my title just a little bit more specific, okay? So let me just stress, I'm here not claiming to be an expert on ageism. I really see my role today as to introduce you to the insights of other scholars, such as Robert Butler or Edward Palmore or Rebecca Levy. And what we're going to do is take a look at ageism as it relates to older adults. It's true ageism can be directed at younger people, and that's really important to understand, but it would be the subject for another talk. So there are 3 things that I'd like us to do today. Take a broad look at the research on ageism, to engage in some private reflection on the topic, and that's actually where we'll go next. And then to hear your insights and questions during the Q&A. And if somebody could raise their hand to reassure me that we now are all on the same page and you're hearing me, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Okay, so just sit back and you might want to make a written note or a mental note. What is your chronological age? How old do you feel right now? As Judy mentioned, maybe some of us have aged a little bit just dealing with the Zoom difficulties. At what point does a person become an old person? And what are the first 5 adjectives that come to mind when you hear the term older adult? What do you already know about ageism?
Walking shoes.
And what questions?
Walking shoes.
And what questions do you have about ageism? Right. So keep a note of your responses, and I promise you there'll be an opportunity to discuss them later in the hour, because I can stay a little bit past the time, and I'm hoping that that will allow us to dig into some of your responses. Okay. But for now, let's go to the research. And what I'd like to do is for us to work our way through the following topics: scholarly interest on ageism, the concept of ageism, some statistics on prevalence, how widespread is it? Some theories about why ageism might exist, and then some discussion of what the consequences are, as well as what can be done about it. Now, that's quite a lot of information, and I want you, please relax, just absorb what you can. And if I mumble over a segment or there's a slide that you would like to dwell on for some more time, I believe we'll be recording. So there'll be an opportunity to go back to all of this material. So the term ageism and its introduction in the 1960s is attributed to Robert Butler, who was a really wonderful physician, gerontologist, and a New Yorker. Butler described ageism in terms of prejudice and discrimination based on a person's age, and he also drew parallels with sexism and racism. So you'll see a quote here from his 1975 book, Why Survive? Ageism is the process of systematic stereotyping or discrimination against people because they're old, just as racism and sexism accomplished with skin color and gender. Ageism allows the younger generations to see older people as different than themselves. Thus, they subtly cease to identify with their elders as human beings. Now, since Butler introduced the term in the 1960s, you'll see that a search of one leading database shows us that the number of scientific publications that have been come out on the topic of ageism and relating to older age groups has risen steadily decade by decade. And that sounds good, right? However, the number of publications on ageism still lags behind topics such as hypertension. The number of articles per decade you see here illustrated by the green line, and depression illustrated by the red line. And I don't know about you, but this seems like a really big difference to me, because you might barely be able to see the number of publications per decade on ageism in the blue. It's quite minuscule in comparison. Now, is that because ageism is a minor phenomenon or is of little consequence? I think we're going to find that that's not the case. So let's go on, though, to talk about the concept of ageism. And what I found in my reading is that ageism has many different facets, and I'd like to walk you through several of them. And while it might seem like a lot of information, it's really worth getting into the details and being able to see its different forms clearly. Nowadays, specialists tend to think of ageism as having three interacting elements: cognitive, emotional, and behavioral. So the cognitive element refers to stereotyping. And what are those, or what's that? Beliefs and expectations about older people and aging that overgeneralize. They ignore individual differences among older adults, and they also involve inaccuracies. That's the cognitive mind dimension. But ageism also involves prejudice, emotional reactions to a person or people based on their perceived or actual age. And then there's discrimination, speech or practices or policies that disadvantage a group or people based on their perceived or actual age. Going farther than that, beyond these three dimensions, ageism can also be considered to be hostile or benevolent. And by hostile, I mean overtly negative, can clearly directly result in disadvantage or harm. And by benevolent, I mean on the surface positive, but sometimes indirectly resulting in disadvantage or harm. So let's continue looking at stereotyping and so forth with this in mind. Stereotypes of older people can be negative or positive. Now, here in the US, common stereotypes of older people, negative stereotypes, are ill or ailing, irrelevant, or incompetent. And you and I can easily see the potential harm of these kinds of stereotypes, right? But there can be positive stereotypes too, like the perfect grandparent, which could seem on the surface not to be harmful, but because they involve overgeneralizations, they can encourage negativity towards older adults who don't conform to those particular attributes. And as I mentioned, stereotypes also involve misconceptions. So here you're seeing data on the screen that indicate the percentage of adults who report poor or fair health, and those who report needing help with basic activities for self-care. And you'll see that the numbers rise with age. But even in the oldest age groups, only a proportion of people report these problems. More than 70% are not dealing with these issues. So much for the stereotype of older people being ill or incompetent. There's also this idea that older age is depressing. Well, let's take a look at what the data show about that. As you can see in the older age groups, the level of depression, or the percentage of people reporting that they're regularly depressed, is actually lower than in younger age groups. Moving along to prejudice, there's a range of emotional responses to old age that are potentially prejudicial, and I've tried to put a few different ones together. You could pick them out as you look at that visual. And moving along to discrimination, yes, discrimination involves behaviors that are overtly harmful, such as mistreating or elder abuse, insulting, ridiculing, ignoring, as well as behaviors that might appear positive but could have some negative effects, such as insisting on helping when help is not requested, or maybe using a patronizing tone, or shielding somebody from negative news, right? They could be well-intentioned, but, and I think an example that's come up in recent months has been how much older adults should distance or use social distancing as a result of the COVID threat, right? In some ways, it's important for people to protect themselves, but to also make their own decisions and choices. Now, going from there, the different elements or dimensions of ageism, specialists also tend to think of ageism as having three interacting levels: institutional, interpersonal, and individual. And I want to take you briefly through those. At the institutional level, ageism involves laws and regulations, policies, and accepted practices. And there are a number of different kinds of areas in which those can occur. And some examples would be perhaps the fact that in healthcare, the treatments that older adults receive in many cases are based on clinical trials that involve younger people. In media, that representations of older adults in our magazines, on television and film capture some of the experience of older adults, but not others. Or in education, there's segregation in terms of the classroom and whether older adults are participating in the education system, perhaps. At the interpersonal level, what we're talking about is something I think that we all are familiar with: interactions with two or more people, where at least one person is experiencing the interaction negatively. They might feel that they are the target or the recipient of age-based thinking or behavior, or they might be witnessing it as a bystander. And there are all kinds of situations, again, where we could see that or observe that. In a family, the younger members of the family might be lecturing an older member of the family about what they should be doing in terms of social distancing. Or in friendship circles, we might be sharing jokes about being over the hill. And I'm not saying that we can't have fun together, but we could be mindful of whether ageism is creeping in, right? In work groups, maybe younger coworkers might not invite an older coworker to join an after work drink because they think that person won't fit in. Or in the classroom, maybe an older student is not called upon to participate. Or in a doctor visit, perhaps the physician spends time talking to the person who's accompanying an older adult, maybe a family member, rather than directing the conversation to the patient. All kinds of different examples that we can think of. And then the last level, of course, is the individual level. And here again, we're talking about stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. Now stay with me because we can go even further. At the individual level, the different elements of ageism are not always directed at other people. They can also be directed at oneself. So an older person might be having thoughts like, I've lost my good looks. I don't have the strength anymore. I'm too old to learn or to date or whatever it may be. There might be emotions like self-doubt or embarrassment or shame. And of course, there are all kinds of behaviors that we can choose or engage in that might be a reflection of ageism being realized in ourselves, like overcompensating, working too hard because we don't trust in our competence, or unnecessarily putting limits on ourselves and excluding ourselves from certain kinds of activities, or maybe making self-deprecating comments. You all can probably think of lots of other examples. And bear with me, we can go even further. So ageism may have explicit and implicit forms. By explicit, I mean it's occurring with awareness, intentionally by choice. And by implicit, I mean occurring without awareness, unintentionally, automatically. So to summarize, ageism as a force, if we think of it in a global way, can be kind of daunting. But if we break it down into its different elements, just like we did right here, I think it can help us to better recognize different forms of ageism as they're occurring, and to think more specifically about how we can address that particular form of ageism. So I think it's really helpful to keep in mind the different dimensions and elements, that it's hostile, can be hostile or benevolent, that there are different levels, the targets can be self or other, and it can be with awareness or without awareness, automatic. And a few additional points. Unlike prejudices such as racism and sexism, where one is in the targeted group or not, it's either or, any one of us can experience age-based prejudice if we live long enough. And of course, ageism doesn't occur in a vacuum. It can interact with other kinds of prejudices like sexism, racism, ableism, which refers to disability, or homophobia. And on the one hand, that can lead to heightened marginalization. And one unfortunate example of that is that where we know after disasters like hurricanes, older adults in minority race communities are perhaps most affected by these kinds of events because of the combined effects of ageism and racism in terms of access to help. On the other hand, prior experiences of prejudice could result in increased coping strengths among people from minority groups. And there is some research data to support that as well. So I've seen studies which suggest that for men who are from a Caucasian or white background, sometimes the effects of ageism may be the first introduction to the experience of marginalization, and that can be very difficult. So I hope you don't feel I'm rushing too much. I'm trying to make up for lost time. And I'd like to take you on now to just looking at how widespread ageism is. And I'm curious what you think. Do you think it's widespread or not? Let's look and see what the data show. First, let's look across history. So researchers who analyze the corpus of historical American English have found that the negativity of terms associated with elderly and its synonyms has steadily increased over the past 200 years. The overall association transitioned from positive to negative in the 1880s. So what you're seeing is before 1880 in the green line, 3 represents neutral. So the green line shows us that before 1880, overall stereotypes more positive than negative. But as time has gone on, illustrated by the blue line, the level of negativity goes above neutral and beyond into increasing negativity. So there's reason to think that society is becoming more ageist over time. Is ageism more prevalent in one age group than another? Well, some studies have shown that the degree to which people explicitly say that they prefer young over old does reduce with age. So if you look at the 18 to 14 age group illustrated by this line, the preference for young over old is quite high, and then the line goes down through to 71. However, by contrast, responses to the implicit association test seem to show that there's a strong implicit preference, an automatic preference for young over old that's quite stable across age groups. And that's illustrated by the line at the top. Now, a few words on the implicit association test. What is it? It involves computerized web-based tasks. And what will happen is somebody will see in an age-based task an old face or a young face, and then they'll be presented with words beneath the horizon of awareness. And they'll need to categorize those words as positive or negative. And the idea is if you see an old face and more quickly are able to categorize a negative word than a positive word, then perhaps elements that are associated with old actually have a stronger association with the negative than the positive. There's a lot of data from, and very interesting data from these kinds of tests. Not everybody has strong confidence in them, but I think they do add something to our understanding of ageism. Going from there, still looking at how widespread ageism is, is ageism a special phenomenon or an everyday phenomenon? Well, in 2019, a University of Michigan poll of more than 2,000 adults ages 50 to 80 found that 82% of respondents reported regular exposure to one or more forms of ageism. 65% reported exposure to ageist messages. 45% reported regularly experiencing ageism in interactions with other people. And 36% reported beliefs that were consistent with internalized ageism. Beliefs that normal aging includes feeling lonely or depressed or sad or worried. And then thinking a little differently, is ageism everywhere or are there regional differences? Well, researchers have used data from the implicit association test. You remember I mentioned it a couple of slides ago. And they've looked at implicit age bias. When they examined results from more than 800,000 participants, ranging from teens to older adults across the nation, they were able to rank states according to the level of age bias. And what you're seeing here is the states that are a light cream color ranked lowest in age bias. Then it goes to yellow, orange, and finally to red. Bright red indicates the highest level of implicit age bias. And for us here in New York, we are here. Shock, horror. I thought we lived in an age-friendly area. Now we could dispute this data, but I want to tell you that the researchers did find that these rankings were mirrored by state-level data on how well older adults in these communities were doing. So when a state is bright red, there's a higher level of implicit bias. There's also a greater level of spending on treatments, health treatments for older adults, suggesting that they may be having more illnesses. And there's a lower state level reported engagement in health behaviors. In other words, that older adults may not be living as healthy a lifestyle as older adults in some of the other states. And then last but not least, what about prevalence across the globe? So oftentimes we wonder to ourselves, perhaps we would be doing better if we were in a collectivist society. Well, to put the situation into global context, here what you're seeing is countries graded for ageism according to data from the World Values Survey. And this grading is based on responses of more than 83,000 participants from 57 countries. And what you can see here is brown represents highly ageist, orange represents moderately ageist, and yellow, the United States and other countries are less ageist countries according to the results of this analysis. So let's move along now to thinking about if ageism, if it exists, why so? And I'm going to walk you very quickly through some theories about why that might be the case. Theories about the roots of ageism consider several different kinds of mechanism: individual, social, and societal. So according to terror management theory, older people serve as threatening reminders of mortality and vulnerability, and ageism represents an attempt to control associated anxiety. Somewhat differently, social identity theory proposes that people maintain a positive sense of self by distinguishing between an in-group, which they view favorably, and an out-group, which they view unfavorably. And under some conditions, older adults or older people represent an unfavorable out-group. Connected to that, the stereotype content model proposes that very early in life, we learn to identify people based on characteristics like age. And we also learn to react negatively to older people by observing how they're treated by others and absorbing ageist cultural messages. And then taking that even further, the stereotype embodiment theory suggests that we internalize stereotypes, we learn stereotypes over time, and then as we ourselves age, we begin to direct those stereotypes towards ourselves. So several different accounts at the individual level. At the social level, evolutionary theory explains ageism as a byproduct of the human species' own programming for survival. So the idea is that groups treat members favorably or unfavorably according to their likelihood of survival. And there's an assumption that older people are less likely to survive. Very differently, another social explanation is age segregation. All of us here are aware that younger and older people become separated when children go to college, or when they establish their own nuclear family, or when older workers retire. And the idea is that this kind of separation fosters alienation and lack of understanding. And last but not least, intergenerational conflict theory focuses on the possibility of tensions between younger and older generations. The theory is that the younger generation expects the transfer of resources from the older generation, and that hostility can arise if they don't perceive that that is happening. Last but not least, societal level explanations. So modernization theory focuses on societal changes that could encourage negativity towards older adults. For example, with increases in longevity, the number of people ages 65 and older has steadily grown over the last century. And one result is that old age has lost some of its special status. In a related vein, technology has eroded the prior close association between life experience and knowledge. So older adults may not quite have the same role as transmitters of wisdom. Others suggest that there's a structural lag in society's thinking about how to reorganize the economy, and it hasn't caught up with gains in longevity. And they point out that policymakers tend to talk about aging of the population as a problem rather than a success story, and that they tend to talk about the problems of federal spending on the older population rather than as a cost, rather than seeing it as an investment. And those kinds of effects can also come into play with ageism. Now, these are just theories, and we could spend some time going deeper into them and looking at how they map onto the data. But for our purposes today, I just want you to be aware of what those are. And let's get to another very important matter, which is what are the consequences of ageism? What kinds of effects might it have? I think I'm doing pretty well getting us close to the kind of time frame I was hoping for. So I'm going to walk you through all of the different potential effects. I think it's so valuable to get a sense of the range of how ageism can be impactful, because it can really motivate us to take steps to address those effects. So I'm going to try and walk you through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different potential types of effects, just giving you a taste of different research studies, what the science might be pointing to, okay? Starting with ageism affecting decisions, choices, and health behaviors. Well, one example would be that researchers examined how expectations of age-related decline, physical activity, and perceptions of one's own health relate to each other. In a sample of more than 100 adults ages 61 to 96, the statistical analysis showed that participants low on internalized ageism, those expecting fewer age-related problems, also reported better health. But while there was a direct effect, what was very interesting was that much of the effect had to do with people with more positive stereotypes of ageism choosing to engage in physical activity, which in turn affected their health or improved their health. Another kind of example, what if, can ageism affect how older adults perform? Well, we know that concerns about confirming negative stereotypes have been documented in women, gay men, and ethnic minorities. And numerous experimental studies have also examined this concern with older adults. Based on their analysis of combined data from 37 studies, it's quite a lot of data, researchers have concluded that age stereotype threat results in small to moderate reductions in older adults' performance. And what I'm referring to is the kind of effect where you walk into a room and you see that everybody's younger than you, and you think to yourself, oh, they're going to think that I'm old and not with it. And then you find that you're mumbling or stumbling over words or having difficulty in conversation. That's an everyday example, but of course, this is done with laboratory type tasks. And this kind of effect might be very specific to certain kinds of conditions. For example, it's been found that fact-based reminders of age maybe have a little less effect than stereotype-based reminders of one's age. And it might be specific to particular kinds of tasks. So the effects are more pronounced for cognitive tasks and memory tasks, not so much for other types of tasks. Moving from there to acute stress, a series of studies have shown us that concern about confirming negative stereotypes can result in acute stress reactions. So how was this done? Researchers had older adults solve math and verbal problems after either being exposed to a positive age cue, they might be primed with the word wisdom, or a negative age cue, dementia. And what they found was that older adults primed with positive cues showed a decrease in systolic blood pressure, which is a marker for stress. Those primed with negative age cues saw an increase in systolic blood pressure. And the same kinds of effects were found for diastolic blood pressure and for skin conductance. Going further than that, what about the effects of cumulative stress, which is stress, repeated exposure to stress over time? Well, one study has shown that in adults 50 and up, participants' view of their own aging, an indicator of how much they'd internalized age stereotypes, predicted stress-related inflammation 4 years later. Conversely, positive perceptions of aging were related to lower levels of subsequent inflammation. And that's really important because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that bodily inflammation has downstream effects for all kinds of health outcomes. A little differently, researchers followed older and younger participants for 30 years, quite an achievement in a longitudinal study. And what they found among older participants, those 50 and up, was that those with negative attitudes towards old age showed significant increases in cortisol over time, while those with more positive beliefs about aging showed minimal changes. Another suggestion that the toll of ageism does accumulate over time. Moving from stress to well-being. There are all kinds of data to suggest that ageism or aspects of ageism negatively affect well-being. In one study from the Health and Retirement study, the perception of being discriminated against due to age or due to weight or due to disability was associated with greater reports of loneliness and lower reports of life satisfaction. I don't think that that's a stretch for any of us to understand how socially isolating it is to feel that we are the recipients of ageism or any kind of discrimination. Along similar lines, in another study from the National Survey of Midlife Development, participants who saw themselves as the target of age discrimination reported less positive emotion and less well-being than those who did not, right? And then over time, the changes in how much one perceived discrimination were also related to changes in well-being. The kind of thing where if somebody began to report increasing levels of discrimination, there would be a drop in their reports of well-being. And last but not least, more data from the Health and Retirement study, participants whose perceptions of age discrimination in the workplace increased over a 4-year study period also showed increases in depression. But there's more. I just want to tell you a little bit about brain health and overall health. In one study from the Baltimore longitudinal study on aging, attitudes towards old age, in other words, the effects of internalized stereotypes, were correlated with changes in brain area. So what you're seeing here is for the hippocampus, which is very important for memory. Here are participants with overall positive views of aging. You see the line stays static. There's very little change in the size of the hippocampus over 10 years. Here are the participants who overall had negative views about aging. And what you're seeing is a steady decline in the size of that brain area over the study period. And in a related study, when autopsies were done among participants who were deceased, brains with moderate or severe signs of disease came from participants who'd expressed more negative views of aging. So if you look at the bar chart on your left, you'll see that the negative age stereotype scores for brains that had mild levels of disease were less than 7, whereas the stereotype scores for participants who had moderate or severe brain disease were around 9, getting close to 10. And then a word about physical and mental health conditions. So Levy and colleagues have calculated how different forms of ageism affect the prevalence of health conditions. And these researchers estimate that in the US in 2013, the combined effects of age discrimination, age stereotypes, and self-perceptions of aging accounted for 17 million cases of major health conditions in adults ages 60 and up. That's a phenomenal number to my ears. And I'll help you decipher this graph just by looking at cardiovascular disease. What you're seeing is the bars represent the difference in prevalence of cardiovascular disease for people at the high end of age discrimination, age stereotyping, and internalized ageism versus the low end. And you'll see each bar is in the positive direction. There's more cardiovascular disease if you score high on these aspects of ageism. And it holds true for all other health conditions too, respiratory, musculoskeletal injuries, and so on. And of course, as you and I can easily imagine, all of this is not just going to lead to increased illness, but there's also a cost in terms of healthcare. So the same authors estimate that ageism-associated healthcare costs total $63 billion in the US in 2013 for adults 60 years and up. And to put that in context, that was about 15% of overall healthcare costs for that age group. And you can see the breakdown is 11.1 billion for age discrimination, 28.5 billion for age stereotypes, and 33.7 billion for negative self-perceptions of aging. Okay, and very important here for us to note that perhaps the most costly aspect of ageism that was determined here was self-directed ageism, right? I did want to say a little bit about the economic impact of ageism among workers, older workers, but I think maybe I'll skip that and people could go to the slides if they want. They could get a copy from the Patient Resource Center or directly from me. I'll just give you the headline here, which is that a report by AARP estimates that the effects, what you're seeing at the bottom in pink, of ageism in terms of creating involuntary retirement, underemployment, and unemployment among workers 50 and older amounts to about $850 billion in lost productivity, or at least did amount to $850 billion in lost productivity in 2018. And I'll say a little bit about interventions to counter ageism. So legal interventions have had a very positive impact in mitigating the impact of ageism. You're probably well aware that the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967 protects workers ages 40 and older, and the Age Discrimination Act of 1975 prohibits discrimination on the basis of age in federally funded programs. There was also a Fair Employment Protection Act that aimed to address workplace discrimination based on age and other factors too, but unfortunately it wasn't brought to a vote. There are also individual level and interpersonal types of intervention, ones that involve education, ones that involve creating opportunities for intergenerational contact, and ones that involve a combination of the approaches. And an example here would be that medical students that while medical college sit in on sessions where an older actor will play the part of an older patient, and they observe in order to learn how to not bring ageism into doctor-patient visits. And I did plan to tell you a little bit about the evidence base for the effectiveness of intervention. What I can tell you very quickly is that interventions have been shown to improve attitudes towards aging, knowledge about aging, and comfort with older adults. But the quality of the research is modest. It could be improved. And very strikingly, most interventions that have been developed target college students or younger people. And there's a real lack of intervention that's targeted for older adults. It's striking because, of course, we've seen that inner-directed ageism is a factor that's going to be really important to address. I did want to take you through some conclusions, but I'm going to skip those. And just invite you, if you can stay beyond the designated time, if you're able to do that, why don't we take 5 minutes to reflect, and then I can hang around till 2:15 if anyone would like to ask questions or add observations. So I just invite you to think of a recent instance in which you reacted negatively towards your own aging. Can you think of one? And what about just the opposite? Can you think of an instance in which you successfully overcame having a negative reaction to your own aging? Can you think of a recent experience in which somebody else seemed to be reacting negatively towards you based on your age? I'm wondering, how did you respond? And as you look back, are you happy with the way that you responded? Can you think of a recent experience in which you observed someone else behaving in an ageist way? I'm wondering if you thought about intervening. And if you did, if you're happy with the way that you responded, or if you didn't, if you're happy about that. Have you ever wanted to raise attention to the issue of ageism in the workplace, in a healthcare setting, in an educational or cultural setting, or with elected officials? We have a mayoral race coming up in New York City, and I'm wondering, do you know what each candidate's position is on ageism? Okay, so those are some of the questions that I wanted to pose to you. If you have been able to stay, I want you to know that there are a few individuals I'd like to thank for having contributed to this presentation, as well as the Patient Resource Center for hosting us. I want to thank you for your participation. And please share with me, share with us, let's talk together about your questions and about your observations. And I should mention that Diana Feldman is here, who is a wonderful colleague at Medical College, who is also a specialist in late life. And if she would like to chime in, that would be wonderful too.
Hi, Nimali. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. Yeah, I had a couple of comments. One, I was just thinking about a different view on ageism. What I see as an educator working with residents, that I actually frequently see ageism directed at the residents. So from patients who are older, not wanting to work with a younger person because they perceive that the younger person will not be able to understand them, which unfortunately sometimes prevents them from getting good care. So it's kind of a person suffering from their own stereotypes, which I mean is true also about self-directed ageism. another thing, I guess another situation that I thought about, people suffering from their own stereotypes and not the people who are the target of those stereotypes, is just the story of the pandemic and how initially it was, widely written about how the victims of COVID are just older people, and how that might have, and I think did affect the swiftness of response, both in society on a political level, that it did not, speed up the response as much as it would have if the story was the children and young people are dying rather than the old people. So I guess in this case of the pandemic, I think it's a really bright example of how ageism can be really affecting the whole society in a very negative way.
Yeah, I want to thank you for sharing. I think those are two really great examples. And I simply want to say it's so helpful when we share these observations. I tend to think that one of the first things that we can do is educate ourselves and then just talk and share. And that in and of itself can perhaps pave the way for us to be a little kinder to ourselves and notice if we're directing ageism towards ourselves. It can energize us to, when there are interactions, to be more comfortable pointing out if we feel that we're experiencing ageism, or to have if other people tell us we're being ageist, to be comfortable reflecting and introspecting about whether that might be the case. And it can also get us motivated to really kind of start to encourage and do what we can to advance social policies and practices that can counter ageism. Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering, does anyone else want to share observations? Or does anyone else have a question?
I just want to share, this is Judy.
Hi, Judy.
I have 2 bionic knees, a shoulder rotator cuff repair, a golfer's elbow surgery. So I've really done a lot to keep Dr. Stephen Feely's children in school. And I just got an electric bicycle and I'm so happy about it. And I've just turned 60 and I love it.
So thank you so much for sharing that. And right, and part of what you're pointing to is with ageism, it can be easy for us to say, to put limits, right, on ourselves and say, I'm too old to, my knees are too old to. But if we identify that, well, whose thought is that? Is that my thought, or is it a message from culture? Maybe we can explore alternatives and what can be done to address problems that we're having. And it sounds like you really have been a superwoman in finding ways to stay connected to what's really important to you as your body is changing, right? So thank you for sharing that. Are there others who would want to chime in?
Well, I will. Hi, Nimali, that was an excellent presentation. This is Louise Andrew. I'm a physician, actually a recovered emergency physician, and in the last 5 or 10 years, anti-aging and regenerative medicine physician. And in answer to Judy and anyone else who's wondering, the number one thing you can do to keep yourself healthy and sane as you age is exercise. Even if it does wear out your joints, it's still the key to everything else continuing to work. And so I've been an avid exerciser for more than half my life. And I just turned 70, by the way. And I don't feel anywhere near 50. I feel quite young. And I hope it'll stay this way if I continue, on the current course. But I represent 57,000 physicians, senior physicians in the AMA. And we have recently done an educational session on ageism. And a lot of people attended it, not just our section members who are over 65. At the beginning of the educational session, 30% believed that they had recognized or been victims of ageism in medicine specifically. And at the end of the session, 80% realized that they had been. So I have to say that there's no question in my mind that we physicians do practice actively ageist behaviors. What do you expect? You're getting old. And I've been a victim of that, but it took this kind of education for me to realize that, that's not right. That's really not fair. And that we need to develop more effective ways to counter it when we are dealing with physicians who have ageist attitudes. We need to establish a dialogue as to what do you say to a physician who says a dismissive thing to you about your complaint, which is very real and deserves attention, when they are just trying to get you out of their office. In emergency medicine, there was a phrase, GOMER, that's a gomer, get out of my emergency room. It's not right. We need to do something about it. And I'm glad that you guys are leading the way in many respects.
Louise, thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to direct you and everyone here on the call to the work of Mark Lax, who is a wonderful colleague in geriatric medicine and palliative care, who's written a book, Treat Me, Not My Age. And I think he speaks to many of the issues that you're pointing to. And so what to do if we're told by a physician, what do you expect at your age, right? I'm not sure I have the answers. Mark, has a short answer. Mark certainly goes into a lot of the details, but number one step, recognize that maybe this is not an answer that's helpful to you. Why is it not helpful to you? Because it frames a problem in a negative way that's global, about a cause that's global, somewhat uncontrollable, and sometimes simply saying, well, can you be more specific? When you say, what do I expect at my age? What age-related factors might be in play? Could start a conversation to get at the specifics about what might be happening and what can be done about it. So just one quick thought. Diana, if you would like to add, or if anyone else here on the call would like to chime in.
That sounds like Andrew.
Is there anything, I skipped some parts, is there anything that anyone would like to go back to or to kind of look at in more detail?
Well, I'd like your opinion, Nimali, because if I was looking at that world map properly, it looks to me as if Japan was one of the countries that was listed as highly ageist when they have the opposite reputation of revering their elders. Do you think the seeming reverence for elders can translate to discriminatory attitudes and behaviors?
Sorry, I hope I'm not dizzying you all. So the takeaway from this particular slide, and it's also from other kinds of research that is involved looking at the cumulative evidence about ageism across countries. Yeah, we tend to think that quote unquote collectivist societies are going to be more supportive of their older populations. But the data seem to be pointing in a different direction. So there is something, and maybe we could be pleased for ourselves about that. There's something about the direction in which the US is going, or New York is going, I like to think, that it's positive. Some important strides have been made, but as you can see from the rest of the data, there's still a ways to go. So it does defy some of the common sense notions that get, common notions that get discussed, day to day.
So this is Louise again. I had mentioned that somewhere I read something that suggested that when physicians have more ageist attitudes, their patients do not do as well, in fact, die sooner. And I checked with Becca Levy about this, and she said she hadn't seen that study. So maybe I just interpreted it from something that I'd seen of hers, because she was the first person I asked. But she felt that was an area that was ripe for research. And I sure would love to see the results, because I believe, from personal experience and from speaking with lots of others in my age category, that you're deflated when your physician will not listen to you with a concern simply because it's a concern that's common in aging populations.
Yeah, that's so important. And I can't say that I've come across that particular study to be able to speak directly to the data, but I really thank you for introducing the point. And it's so heartening to know that physicians' organizations are working on this issue at the physician level. And as allied healthcare workers, we, Diana, I, and others can work also on ageism in our practices. And then at the patient level, we also have the power to learn, speak up. So I think it's tremendously important. And let me just go back also to Diana's point about patients, or all of us potentially excluding ourselves from working with younger people, or assuming that we won't get the treatment and the care we want from younger people. Diana, are you still on the call? Oh, she might have had to drop off. I think that's another important point for us to reflect on. There's a wonderful World Health Organization publication on ageism that attends to both ageism as it relates to older adults, but also as it relates to younger age groups. So for those of you on the call, certainly I encourage you to look at that publication to learn more about that particular topic. And again, I think it will be very helpful if we all, no matter what our age, are mindful of and begin to really pay attention to, are we making assumptions about other people based on their perceived age, or what we expect, what we assess their age to be.
Well, Nimali, this has been a fascinating talk, and one that I think we'd probably like to pick up again at some point later in the series.
Absolutely. So I'm hoping, I'm hoping that we could have a follow-up to this that could be more discussion.
Sure.
And if on those of you on the call, if you're interested in that, please let Judy Stribling know so that we can gauge what the level of interest would be and figure out how to arrange that. It's been a delight to be here with you. I thank you all for your contributions, and I hope that you will enjoy the rest of this sunny May day.
And I want you all to know that this has been recorded, and it will be available on the Myra Mann Patient Resource YouTube channel. So Nimali, thank you for your time. and everyone for coming and listening. This has been fantastic today. And